What if the crimes you've been chasing lead to something far more terrifying than you ever imagined? A place where reality itself starts to crumble, and you're caught in a race against time, and monsters you never saw coming. This is a story of ancient secrets, paranormal forces, and a truth so dark, it will leave you questioning everything. Stay with us until the end, because this is no ordinary case. It's a nightmare that's far from over. This should grab attention and keep your viewers hooked throughout the video. The desert air was thick with heat. The sun, relentless, beat down on Nevada's vast emptiness. Dust swirled in the air, coating everything. In the distance, a solitary figure moved. Agent Hannah Lewis adjusted her sunglasses and squinted. Her boots crunched the dry ground as she approached the abandoned building. It had been quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence that made your skin crawl. She pulled out her notepad and scanned the area. Her mind raced. Something was off. This wasn't just another crime scene. She could feel it. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. The building loomed ahead, its windows shattered. Shadows danced on the walls inside. She stepped closer. The door creaked open as if welcoming her in. A chill ran down her spine. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of decay. The walls were covered in strange markings, barely visible in the dim light. Her flashlight flickered as she scanned the room. There were no bodies. No signs of struggle. Just emptiness. And then something moved. A sound. Faint but clear. She froze, her heart racing. The noise came from behind a stack of crates. Her breath hitched as she approached, her footsteps almost inaudible. As she rounded the corner, her flashlight caught something. A pair of eyes, staring directly at her. But they weren't human. The creature's skin was slick, its pupils dilated in fear. It shrieked, a sound that cut through the silence like a knife. Agent Lewis staggered back, barely holding her ground. The creature lunged. Her gun was out, but her hands trembled. She fired once, twice. The creature crumpled to the floor, twitching. But as it died, something strange happened. Another figure appeared in the shadows. It was human, yet its eyes glowed with an unnatural light. Her mind raced. Was this connected to the string of bizarre crimes that had been reported? Suddenly, the building seemed alive with activity. Footsteps echoed from all directions. She was surrounded. The walls seemed to close in around her. The sound of footsteps grew louder. Too many to count. Her pulse quickened. Her mind scrambled for a plan. But there was no time. A figure stepped forward from the shadows. Tall. Unnaturally still. Its skin was pale, almost translucent. It smiled at her, but there was no warmth in it. "You're too late," it whispered. The words sent a shiver through her body. Before she could react, more figures emerged, circling her. They moved with the same unsettling silence. Her gun felt heavy in her hand, her breath shallow, heart pounding. Then, the leader stepped closer, its cold eyes locked on hers. "You think you're the first to come here?" it asked, its voice barely a whisper. Hannah's mind raced. What was happening? What had she stumbled into? The truth hit her like a ton of bricks. This was no ordinary criminal syndicate. It was something darker, something unnatural. The leader reached out a long, slender hand. Before she could react, it touched her arm. A wave of cold spread through her body. Her limbs froze. Her vision blurred. "Welcome to the real Nevada," the leader said. The words echoed in her mind as everything went black. When she awoke, she was alone. The building was empty. The figures were gone. But the fear remained. Her body ached, her mind foggy. What had just happened? She stumbled to her feet, trying to make sense of it all. The door was wide open now. But outside, the desert was just as quiet as before. No trace of the nightmare she'd just faced. But something inside her had changed. Her gut twisted with an unsettling certainty. This was only the beginning. The crimes were not what they seemed. And the truth was far darker than she could have imagined. She made her way to the FBI van outside, her steps unsteady. She had to report in. But as she reached for the door, she stopped. A voice, faint but clear. It came from behind her. The same whisper.
"You're not safe yet."
Her blood ran cold. There was more to this than anyone could possibly know. The whisper lingered in her ears, like a ghost that refused to leave. Hannah spun around, her heart pounding, but no one was there. The desert stretched out before her, empty and desolate. She wiped the sweat from her brow, her hands shaking. Was she losing her mind? She had to get back to the team. But that voice, it couldn't have been in her head. It was too real. With a deep breath, she climbed into the van and slammed the door shut. Her partner, Agent Carter, was behind the wheel. He didn't look up as she entered. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot. "You okay?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Hannah opened her mouth, but the words caught in her throat. She didn't know where to begin. What could she tell him? There was no way to explain what had just happened. I don't know," she muttered, staring at the dashboard. "Something's wrong, Carter. I don't think we're dealing with normal criminals here." He glanced over at her, eyebrows raised. "Normal criminals? What do you mean?" She hesitated. The images, the voices, the creatures, they all flashed in her mind. It was too much to process. Too much to say. "Just trust me," she said, her voice low. Carter didn't press her. He turned the key, and the van rumbled to life. As they drove through the barren landscape, the weight of the silence pressed in on her. What was she supposed to do now? She couldn't ignore what had happened, what she had seen. But there were no answers. No clues. Only more questions. Hours passed, and they reached the FBI headquarters in Nevada. The office was buzzing with activity as they entered. The team was waiting for them. "Agent Lewis," a voice called. It was Director Anderson. He stepped forward, his expression serious. "We've been tracking these crimes for months. We need answers." Hannah nodded, trying to steady her nerves. But just as she was about to speak, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out. A new message. It was from an unknown number. Her stomach dropped as she read it. "We're watching you." Her blood ran cold. She looked around the room, eyes darting from face to face. Was it them? Were they here? Her instincts screamed at her to run. The room felt suffocating. Her breath came in short gasps. She could almost feel their eyes on her. Director Anderson was still talking, but his voice was muffled in the background. The words didn't reach her. Her finger hovered over the phone screen. The message seemed to burn into her mind. "We're watching you." She scanned the room again, her heart racing. Was someone here? The message had to mean something. Her gaze flickered across her colleagues, their faces all a blur. Had they sent the message? Was one of them part of this? Agent Lewis? The voice cut through her panic. It was Carter. She blinked, focusing back on him. "What?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." Hannah swallowed hard. I don't know what's going on," she said, her voice shaking. "There's something wrong with this case, Carter. I'm not sure who to trust anymore." He looked at her, his brow furrowing. "You need to calm down. Let's go over everything we know, and we'll figure it out." She nodded weakly, though her mind was still a whirlwind. The director was speaking again, but this time, Hannah couldn't focus. Her phone buzzed once more. This time, it was a picture. A dark, shadowy figure standing in front of the abandoned building. It was the same figure she'd seen earlier. The one that had whispered in her ear. Her blood turned to ice. The figure in the picture wasn't just some random stranger. It was the same one from the nightmares. Her breath caught in her throat. "Agent Lewis?" Hannah snapped back to reality. Everyone was looking at her now, their faces full of concern. Director Anderson stepped forward. "Is everything all right?" he asked, his voice now tinged with suspicion. She nodded, forcing a smile, but it felt hollow. She couldn't let them see how terrified she was. But deep down, she knew this wasn't just a case anymore. It was something far worse. And someone or something was watching her. The question was, what did they want? Hannah felt the weight of their eyes on her, pressing down like a 1,000-pound boulder. The room suddenly felt smaller, the air thicker. Her heart was pounding in her chest, the thudding almost deafening in her ears. She could still see the picture on her phone, the shadowy figure staring back at her. A chill ran down her spine. Director Anderson's voice pulled her out of her spiral. "Agent Lewis, you've gone pale. You need to take a moment. What happened at the site?" She opened her mouth, but the words didn't come. How could she explain it? The creatures, the cold touch, the whispers in the dark. Could they even understand? "I saw something," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Everyone leaned in closer, their eyes narrowing. "What did you see?" Anderson asked, his voice low, almost too calm. The silence that followed was suffocating. The room felt like it was closing in. Hannah's throat tightened. "I don't know how to explain it," she muttered. I think we're dealing with something other than criminals. It's not human." A murmur rippled through the team. Carter stepped forward, his face hardening. "You're not making sense, Hannah. What are you trying to say?" She took a deep breath, forcing herself to steady. "They were creatures," she said, her words slow, deliberate. "Things that weren't human. Their eyes, their movements, they were unnatural." The room fell deathly quiet. Director Anderson exchanged a glance with one of the other agents, then turned back to Hannah. "I need more than that," he said flatly. Hannah shook her head, frustration bubbling inside her. "I know what I saw," she snapped, her voice rising. "This isn't just about crimes. It's something darker. Something far more dangerous." She could see the doubt in their eyes, but she didn't care anymore. There was no going back. "We have to take this seriously," she insisted. "They're out there, watching us." And as if on cue, her phone buzzed again. This time, there was no message, only a strange, distorted noise, like static. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. It was a warning. She knew it. The figures weren't just watching, they were getting closer. The entire room seemed to hold its breath as the sound continued. Then it abruptly stopped. Director Anderson narrowed his eyes. "All right, Agent Lewis," he said, his tone sharp. "We'll take your concerns into account. But we need concrete evidence. I suggest you rest for now. We'll continue with the investigation." Hannah wanted to argue, to press harder, but the words caught in her throat. Her mind was a blur, the lines between reality and nightmare becoming harder to distinguish. As the agents around her began to disperse, she felt a sense of dread creeping up her spine. She wasn't just haunted by what had happened, she was being hunted, and there was no escaping it. The hours seemed to stretch on endlessly. Hannah sat in the dimly lit conference room, her hands clenched tightly around her notepad. The flickering overhead lights cast long shadows across the walls, making her feel like she was being watched, always watched. The events from earlier replayed in her mind, each detail sharper than the last. The figures, the creature's cold eyes, the whispered warning. And now, the silence that filled the FBI headquarters felt suffocating. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that something was already here. Her thoughts were interrupted by the soft hum of her phone. She glanced down, her stomach twisting into knots. Another message. This time, no words, just a single image. It was a picture of the building. But there was something different about it now. The shadows were darker, more alive. And in the corner of the image, a pair of glowing eyes. Watching. Her hands shook as she pressed the screen, zooming in on the photo. It couldn't be. It was the same eyes she had seen before, the same figure. The terror in her chest grew, suffocating her. There was no escape. Hannah jumped when the door to the conference room suddenly creaked open. Carter stepped inside, looking uneasy. "You all right?" he asked quietly, closing the door behind him. She nodded, but it didn't feel convincing. "I don't think I'm going to be able to sleep tonight," she murmured. "That's not the worst of it," he said. "We've got a lead." Hannah's eyes snapped to him. "A lead," she repeated. "What kind of lead?" Carter took a deep breath, clearly trying to steady himself. "We tracked down the last person to live in that building," he said. "He's been in hiding. But we found him." Her heart skipped a beat. "Where is he?" she asked urgently. "He's at a motel," Carter said, his voice tight. "But there's something strange about it, Hannah. The guy, he's not acting like he should be. It's almost like he knows we're coming." A cold knot tightened in her stomach. "Let's go," she said, standing up quickly. "We need to talk to him."
Now?
They left the room without another word, heading down the sterile halls of the FBI headquarters. But as they walked toward the exit, something caught Hannah's attention. A figure standing at the far end of the hallway. She froze. Her heart skipped. It was the same figure. The glowing eyes, the pale skin, just like the one in the photograph. It was watching them, waiting. Carter turned around, following her gaze. But the figure was already gone. "Did you?" He stopped mid-sentence, his voice faltering. Hannah didn't answer. She knew what she'd seen, and she wasn't about to let it go. They rushed out of the building, the heat of the Nevada desert greeting them like a suffocating blanket. The night had fallen, but it felt like a shadow was closing in. Every step felt like they were walking into the unknown, and they had no idea what was waiting for them. The car sped down the desolate Nevada highway, the headlights cutting through the darkness like a knife. Hannah gripped the door handle, her nerves tight. Carter drove in silence, his jaw clenched, his eyes flickering nervously to the rearview mirror. She couldn't shake the image of the figure, its eyes, watching them from the shadows. Her mind raced. Was it all connected? The strange crimes, the eerie creatures, the whispers. It had to be. There was no other explanation. The motel came into view in the distance. It was small, a rundown place tucked away from the main road. The neon sign above flickered, casting an eerie glow across the cracked pavement. Hannah's stomach twisted. "This is it," Carter muttered, pulling into the parking lot. The place looked abandoned. The lights were dim, and the air was thick with an unsettling quiet. Hannah's breath caught as they parked near the entrance. The door to room 6 was slightly ajar. It looked like someone had been waiting for them. "Stay close," Carter warned, his voice low. They approached the door cautiously, their footsteps muffled on the cracked asphalt. Hannah felt her pulse quicken with each step. The door creaked open when Carter pushed it. The room was dark, the curtains drawn tightly shut. But there, sitting in the corner of the room, was a man. He was hunched over, his face hidden by the shadows. As they stepped closer, he slowly looked up. Hannah froze. His eyes were wide, unblinking. They glowed, just like the creatures. The same unnatural, piercing light. Carter took a step forward, his hand instinctively reaching for his weapon. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice sharp. The man didn't speak at first. He just stared at them, his eyes glimmering with something dangerous. Then, in a raspy voice, he finally spoke. "You're too late," he said softly. Hannah's blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man's lips curled into a twisted smile. "They're already here?" The room seemed to grow colder. A low hum filled the air, vibrating through Hannah's bones. And then, from the shadows, the figure stepped forward. The same figure they had seen before. The one with the glowing eyes. Only this time, it wasn't just one. There were more. Hannah stumbled back, her heart racing. Carter raised his gun, but his hand shook. The figure circled them, their movements impossibly smooth, as if they weren't human. "You shouldn't have come," the man in the corner whispered again. Before Hannah could respond, One of the figures lunged. Carter fired, the gunshot echoing through the room. But the bullet didn't stop it. It kept coming. And then everything went black. The world felt as though it was spinning, disorienting and heavy. Hannah's chest was tight, her breath shallow. She couldn't move,
Couldn't think.
but she could hear. The ringing in her ears was deafening. She tried to open her eyes, but the darkness was suffocating. A figure loomed over her, blocking out the faint light. Her heart skipped a beat. Was it one of them? A cold hand pressed against her face, turning her toward the voice. "You're awake," it said. The voice was familiar. It was Carter's. She gasped, her vision clearing, but her surroundings were strange, alien. They weren't in the motel room anymore. She was lying on a cold stone floor, the walls towering high around her. The air was thick with a heavy, metallic scent. A faint glow pulsed from deep within the cavernous space. Her head ached, and her hands trembled as she tried to sit up. Carter was standing nearby, his face pale, his eyes wide with disbelief. Where are we?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. The figures were gone, but the fear remained. Carter swallowed hard, his eyes darting around the vast, underground chamber.
"I don't know," he replied.
"We were in the motel and then—" His voice trailed off. He seemed lost, as if trying to piece together what had just happened. Hannah stood, her knees weak. The floor beneath her was cold, smooth, and unnatural. Something about it felt wrong. The walls seemed to hum with an eerie energy, and the shadows shifted like they were alive. She felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread. They weren't just somewhere unknown. They were somewhere they shouldn't be. A noise echoed through the chamber, a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the ground. Her skin prickled. She wasn't alone. They were being watched. "Stay close," she whispered to Carter, though her voice barely carried over the silence. The hum grew louder, and as she stepped forward, the walls seemed to pulse with a sinister rhythm. Carter grabbed her arm, his grip tight. "What is this place, Hannah?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Hannah didn't have an answer, but she felt it. The walls were closing in. And then, from the darkness, the figures emerged once more. Only this time they were different. Their eyes glowed brighter, their movements more deliberate. There were more of them. Too many. Their cold, emotionless eyes locked onto Hannah and Carter. And then in unison they spoke. "You cannot escape," they whispered, their voices low and harmonized. Hannah's heart raced, her pulse thundering in her ears. She had no plan. No way out. They were trapped. The figures began to move toward them, their presence suffocating. And in that moment it hit her. This wasn't just a crime ring. It was something ancient, something otherworldly. And they had been drawn into it, trapped in a nightmare where escape wasn't an option. The figures moved closer, their presence overwhelming. The air grew colder with each step they took, the very atmosphere thick with an unnatural weight. Hannah's mind raced, but her body felt frozen, as if the fear had wrapped around her limbs, keeping her still. Carter's grip on her arm tightened, but she could feel him shaking. He wasn't in control, and neither was she. The figures stopped just short of them, standing in perfect alignment like soldiers, their glowing eyes never leaving their targets. Their faces were almost human, but there was something unsettlingly off about them, something wrong. The lead figure, taller than the rest, its eyes the brightest, stepped forward. "Why did you come?" it asked in a voice that was both calm and menacing. Hannah swallowed, trying to steady her racing heart. We're just trying to understand," she managed, though her voice sounded far weaker than she intended. The figure tilted its head, studying her. "You understand nothing." The words echoed in the vast chamber, bouncing off the stone walls like a forgotten whisper. Hannah's stomach churned. "We have to stop them," Carter muttered, his voice barely audible, barely steady. "We can't let them continue." Hannah turned to him, panic rising in her chest. "Stop who?" she whispered, afraid to even ask. But the figure answered her anyway. "The ones who brought you here. The ones who thought they could use you." Hannah's blood ran cold. "The ones who brought them here?
Who was it?
Who are you?" she demanded, trying to summon any trace of strength. The lead figure paused, and for a moment, everything seemed to hold still. The hum in the air faded, leaving only the sound of their shallow breathing. "We're the ones who have always been here," the figure replied, its voice like the scraping of stone on stone. "We are the keepers of the truth." Hannah blinked, confused, her mind spinning. "What truth?" she asked. "What is happening?" The figure's glowing eyes narrowed, and its voice turned colder. "The truth that your world is not what it seems. That your reality is a lie, a construct, a game." A chill shot down Hannah's spine. A game? She didn't have time to process the words before the room began to shake. The walls rumbled, and the ground beneath them quivered, as if the very foundation of the earth was cracking. A low, ominous roar filled the space, reverberating off the stone walls. Hannah's heart slammed in her chest. "They've come," the figure whispered, its voice laced with dread. Carter pulled her closer, his breath ragged, his face pale with fear. Before either of them could react, the shadows around them deepened, and from the darkness, more figures began to emerge. But these were different, far more monstrous. Their forms shifted in the darkness, distorted and grotesque, their eyes like burning embers. The lead figure stepped back, its calm demeanor fading. "Leave now," it commanded, its voice sharp and panicked. "Or you will never leave." Hannah's pulse surged. There was no escaping this place. No way out. The air felt like it was closing in on her, thick and suffocating. She turned to Carter, her eyes wide with terror. "What do we do?" she gasped. Carter's grip tightened on her arm. "We fight," he said, his voice a quiet whisper of determination. But the figures weren't waiting. They moved in on them, and as they did, the ground began to crack open beneath their feet. Hannah looked down in horror as the earth split wide open, swallowing everything in its path. The figures didn't stop. They didn't need to. And before Hannah could react, the floor gave way completely, plunging them into the darkness below. The fall seemed endless. Hannah's stomach lurched, her body weightless as she plunged into the unknown. The darkness surrounded her, thick and suffocating, like a void with no end. Her mind screamed for a way out, but her limbs refused to respond. Then, with a harsh jolt, she hit the ground. Pain shot through her body, but she managed to scramble to her feet, her hands shaking. Her breath came in sharp gasps as she tried to steady herself. The air was different here, cooler, heavier, but it didn't have the same metallic quality as before. The ground beneath her was smooth, but it felt unnatural, like the surface of something that wasn't meant to be touched. Carter landed beside her with a grunt, rolling to his feet quickly, his eyes wide and frantic. "What the hell was that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Hannah didn't answer. She couldn't. Her eyes scanned their surroundings, trying to make sense of where they were. The space stretched out endlessly, the walls impossibly far apart, and yet they were closing in. Every direction felt wrong, the shadows shifting unnaturally. She could feel the oppressive weight of it all, a constant pressure in the air, a feeling that something was breathing down their necks. Carter's hand reached for his gun, but it was a futile gesture. The figures were no longer there, but they hadn't gone far. She could feel their presence in the air. They were still watching. "Where are we?" Carter asked, his voice trembling now. Hannah took a deep breath, forcing herself to focus. "I don't know," she said. "But I think we've crossed into something beyond." Her eyes darted around, trying to make sense of the endless dark space around them. A sound. A low hum, almost imperceptible at first. Then, it grew louder, vibrating through her chest. A voice echoed through the emptiness. "You shouldn't have come," it whispered. Hannah froze. It was the same voice, the same cold, familiar tone from before. And in that instant she understood. There was no escaping. They had crossed a line, entered a realm they could never leave. The truth they had uncovered was too much for the human mind to comprehend. This place wasn't just a prison, it was a gateway. And they were trapped forever. The figures began to materialize in the distance, their glowing eyes piercing the darkness. And as they moved closer, Hannah realized the truth of their words. This was no longer about crime or investigation. It was about survival. And even then it was too late. The figures surrounded them, their eyes glowing like distant stars in the endless void. Hannah's breath was shallow, her mind racing. There was no way out, no escape. The shadows pressed in from every side, and the figures closed in, their silent presence oppressive. Carter's hand gripped hers, trembling. "Stay close," he whispered. But Hannah knew it was pointless. The figures were here for one reason, to finish what had started. She could feel it now, the growing pressure in the air, the weight of the darkness suffocating her. Her legs felt weak, like they were being pulled into the ground. And as the figures inched forward, she knew the truth. They weren't here to kill them. They were here to watch them break, to make them understand. The lead figure stepped closer, its glowing eyes fixed on her, unblinking. "You have seen the truth," it said softly, its voice like ice. "And now you are part of it." Hannah's heart pounded, the fear almost too much to bear. "What do you want from us?" she gasped, her voice barely audible. The figure's lips twitched, almost imperceptibly.
"Nothing," it replied.
"We do not need anything. You are the ones who sought us out." Carter's grip tightened, but the words fell heavy on the air. Hannah's mind struggled to comprehend, but she couldn't escape the sense that they were no longer in control. The world, the reality they once knew, was slipping away, and all that remained was the truth. The figures did not speak again. They didn't need to. Hannah closed her eyes, her mind filling with the sensation of something ancient, something beyond time itself, seeping into her bones. The darkness pressed in, thick and consuming, and then nothing. Silence. When she opened her eyes again, the void was gone. The figures had vanished. The chamber was still, but it felt different, empty. She looked around, her senses heightened, every detail sharp. The walls, the ground, the air, they all felt distant now. The figures had left them with nothing but the haunting knowledge of what lay beyond the world they once knew. A truth they could never forget. And as the faintest hint of light returned to the horizon, Hannah realized one thing. There would be no return to what they had known. They were lost, forever bound to the truth they had uncovered. The world they once understood had unraveled, and in its place, there was only the endless, consuming darkness.